I would say I come with fear and trepidation. I've done this a few times today already, though. So that doesn't mean I'm comfortable with it because, this is really cross-cultural stuff, countercultural stuff, where Jesus' language and Jesus' teaching on sex and purity is so cross-cultural these days, it's complicated. So I'll call this, it's complicated, partly because in Matthew 19 there we got a bunch of complications, and we're going to bounce off that for a bit of a topical talk. I'm going to pray, though, as we come to this. Father, it can be tough when your words are so countercultural. It can be tough because we want to compromise, because we want to excuse it away, so please help us not to do that. Please help us to sit under your word tonight. Help us to learn to love you better and to love each other better through what you've got to say to us tonight. Amen. Now, pretty much exactly a year ago, I did a talk on a similar topic called sex and self-control. And what I want to do today is not cover that same ground. So here is a link for that talk from a year ago. And Byron also has that on a piece of paper at the back, so if you want to grab that later, you can. But I'm going to give you a super quick summary of that, which means there's a lot of really big stuff here that I'm not honestly going to do justice to. So I'm sorry about that, but at the same time, go back and listen to that other talk. But firstly, the talk from last year. Sex is a good thing created by God. God didn't have to make sex enjoyable, but he chose to do that for us. He did it not just for our enjoyment, but also, of course, for the procreation of the human race. And that's part of what we were created for. So this is right back, we're talking first chapters of Genesis here. But he also created sex as a picture of God's love for us. God's relationship with his people throughout the Bible is described in marriage terms. So quite often in the Old Testament, you see that Israel is God's unfaithful wife. Yet we see God's faithfulness to Israel through that, in that while she keeps mucking up, he keeps coming back and saying, I'm still going to be faithful to you. And then right at the other end of the Bible, we're heading towards the big wedding reception in Revelation, where God's people are prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband, as it says in Revelation 21. And that's where it's talking about, that's talking about God's people. The church is the bride and Christ is the husband. So that was the first thing I said last year. The second thing, what the Bible calls sexual immorality, and I don't often use Greek words, but this is an important one for you to remember. Greek porneia, easy to remember because it's where we get our word pornography from, is defined as two people acting as if they are married when they are not married, sleeping together in a way that God designed only for a man and woman to married to each other. God said that this type of relationship is for married people only, and Jesus himself affirmed this in this passage that we've just read. The first Christians at the Jerusalem Council, which we read about in Acts 15, they also affirmed this as one of the very few important things they said for Gentile converts to Christianity. The third thing that I said last year was that Jesus has the right to tell us what to do with our bodies as Christians because he's made us completely new, because we belong to him and our bodies belong to him, because he is worth giving everything up for, and because his commands are for our good and our flourishing, not for our ill. So in light of all that, and as I said, please do go back and listen to it because there's a whole lot more to it than that, of course. What do we do when it all doesn't work out like Genesis 1 and 2? As I said, in this passage in Matthew 19, there are a bunch of different complications to the ideal of marriage and intimacy that's presented in Genesis 1 and 2. Sex, intimacy, relationship, they're all good pre-fall things, like things that were good before sin entered the world. But those things are complicated by the fall. They're complicated by sin. Just in this passage, we see interruption to this goodness comes through divorce. Verses 3 to 7 talk about divorce, where these guys come to Jesus and they say, well, We've just got to give a certificate of divorce to our wife to divorce her for any reason, right? And Jesus says, well, this is kind of true, but it's true because you have a hardened heart. In other words, if there was no sin, there would be no divorce. If there was no sin, there would be no hard hearts towards each other and towards us, between us and God. Now, young people, well, there's a fair few young people here, particularly you guys who've never been married or not so young who've never been married. One of the dangers, I think, is for us to think, when I say us, this was me when I was younger, think that marriage is going to solve all your problems. This was definitely me when I was younger. I know a guy who had a porn addiction, and his attitude was, well, when I meet a woman and I get married, that's just going to fix that problem. Because then I'll be able to have sex with a real woman whenever I want, right? But I'm sure you all know the reality is that instead he carried the baggage from this addiction into his marriage. It affected how he treated his wife. It affected how he approached sex. And the problem didn't go away, but got complicated and caused conflict in his marriage. Now, that's just one example, but I'm sure you get the idea, and you can think of other examples where people think, well, if I just get married, then this problem will go away. See, marriage is essentially two sinners living together in a fallen world. So there's no surprise that there's going to be conflict. And to cut to the chase, sometimes that means marriages end. And I know there are people here who have been affected by divorce, so I know this is a deeply personal thing for many of us here. And in fact, I think I was talking to someone after the service this morning, and we were saying that pretty much most people in some way or another are affected by divorce, whether they've experienced them themselves or their parents or someone close to them. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what the Bible says then about biblical grounds for divorce, because it comes up here in verses 9 and 10 where Jesus says that sexual immorality and adultery are grounds for divorce. The difference being that here that sexual immorality is what I was talking about earlier, that Greek word porneia, which covers a lot more ground. It is anything outside what Jesus would call marriage. Whereas adultery is specifically a married person breaking their marriage vows through sexual immorality. And you might have a lot of questions about the limits of those sort of things. You know, again, to use pornography as an example, is pornography use a reason for divorce? Well, not necessarily, but it could be. There's a lot of different sort of things that might go into that. A lot of you've got to take each situation individually. Each situation is different. It would depend on a lot of things. Is it an addiction? Is it a once-off? Is there genuine repentance? Is there signs of those sort of things? But what I want you to note above all those sort of things is that there is not a command to divorce here. In other words, there's always room for grace and reconciliation. The other major place in the Bible that talks about, or in the New Testament at least, that talks about divorce is 1 Corinthians 7. In that case, Paul talks about a believer who has an unbelieving spouse, and if the unbeliever sort of runs out on them, Paul says it's okay to divorce that person and remarry them. But there's more to it than that. So we've got two reasons so far, right? We've got sexual immorality, we've got if an unbelieving spouse flees. But there's a third one, and it's talked about a bit more hidden in this passage. And I haven't got time to go through it in detail, but to give a quick summary, spouses, in verses 2 to 5 in that chapter, spouses mustn't deny one another's sex. Spouses mustn't neglect or abandon one another. Spouses must provide for one another. And these ideas, some commentators have noted, actually parallel really closely a chapter in the Old Testament, Exodus chapter 21, which does talk about divorce. And in Exodus 21 allows divorce for when this sort of thing, this neglect or this abuse actually happens. So as one scholar puts it, divorce is legitimate when those requirements are not met. That is, when one breaks the marriage covenant. You know, for those who are married here, or those promises you made when you were married, to love each other, to comfort each other, to honour each other, to protect each other, to be faithful to each other in all circumstances when those things are broken. Now, I'm pausing on this and taking a little bit of extra time on it because there's a truth that some people in churches have been taught that wives should endure abuse and that abuse isn't a grounds for a divorce. And I want to say as plainly as I can that that is dead wrong. If you are currently trapped in a marriage, in an abusive relationship, please know that you are not biblically obligated to stay married to your abuser. God sees your suffering and he doesn't require you to stay bound to a person who harms you and has broken the marriage covenant. I want that to be clear before we move on to the only alternative to marriage that Jesus talks about here. So there's this whole thing after all this then about eunuchs in verse 12. If you don't know, a eunuch was a person in ancient time who was a servant of the king, and he often looked after the king's harem, that is his collection of wives and sexual partners, and I use that really kind of vulgar description on purpose because that's pretty much how these women were treated. Basically, because the servant was dealing with the king's women, he was castrated so that he could be trusted. Brutal but efficient, right? But that's why Jesus could say here that there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. But then he also says there are eunuchs who are born that way, and surprisingly, those who choose to live like a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, some are willing to forego marriage by choice. And this is a reaction to Jesus talking about the heavy commitment that there is to marriage here. The disciples' response to Jesus, what Jesus says about marriage is, well, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry. Given the Christian standard of commitment for marriage, is it worth it? Now, I haven't preached at too many weddings where they've come up to me afterwards and said, I don't know if I want to go through with this anymore. Maybe I'm not preaching enough like Jesus about marriage. I don't know. But this bit about eunuchs is his response to that. They say, is it worth it? And he says this bit about eunuchs. He doesn't soften his stance on marriage. In fact, he kind of doubles down on it. Sam Albury, who is a same-sex attracted celibate pastor, wrote a great book called 7 Myths About Singleness. I read the whole thing. It's only quite short, and I recommend, whether you're married or single, reading it is really good. Bounce off it a fair bit in the rest of this talk. He said this. He said, when the disciples raised the possibility of not getting married, Jesus talks to them about being eunuchs. As far as he is concerned, that is the only godly alternative to marriage. To put it simply, the people Jesus is talking about here who choose to live a life like a eunuch are people who, for one reason or another, choose to live the alternative to marriage, which Jesus says is a single celibate life. Single people. And that's all of us at some point, isn't it? Whether we haven't been married yet or whether we will never marry, whether we are divorced, whether we are widowed. But then there are people who choose this lifestyle, as Jesus says. Why would someone choose this lifestyle? That we'd even ask that question actually tells us a lot about the value we place on singleness or the value we don't place on singleness. And I know you didn't really ask that question. I'm kind of asking it for you. But Christians often tend to think of singleness, right, as a placekeeper position until a person gets married. As Sam Albury again says, he says single people are unmarried. Well, I'd never call my married friends unsingle. But what if instead we saw the goodness in singleness? What if we remember that Jesus himself, when he is talking in this very passage about some who choose to live a single life for the sake of the kingdom of God, he's talking about himself. He did that. He willingly became human for us. He became a male. He was a sexual human being just like all of us, but he never married, he never had sex. In other words, he wasn't calling others to a standard he wasn't willing to embrace himself. So the next time that someone says that the Christian teaching on sex is repressive, remember that the most perfect person who ever lived without sex, and he was just fine. And he showed that marriage and romance and sex have nothing to do with being a full human, because he was the most full human that ever existed. So what if we saw then singleness as an opportunity? An opportunity first to serve God in his kingdom. Again, in 1 Corinthians 7, where that other passage I was talking about, where Paul talks about in that a single person is free from certain anxieties and can serve God because of that. So, as a married guy, every decision I make has to take into consideration my wife and my 5 children. I can't just go, I might take a job on the other side of Australia without consulting them, right? I might, but I might not. I might become single very quick. There are certain places I might not be able to go. There are certain things I might not be able to do. There are certain ministries I might not be able to engage in as freely as a single person has. And that's how Paul sees the advantage of singleness. Now, of course, there's a big assumption in that, though, and I want to use Sam Albury's voice again because he is a single guy and I want to talk to the single people here. Paul is assuming, Sam Albury says, that singles will be anxious about the things of the Lord. It's easy to channel our flexibility and energies into merely pleasing ourselves rather than God. And that really goes for all of us, doesn't it, whether we're married or single. We can easily become anxious, he says, about the things of me. It's easy to do what I want, how I want, when I want. Single people don't have a significant other to flex around. If I want to go out, I can. If I want to have some space for myself, I can. For us singles, he says, it's much easier to eat when we want and sleep when we want. We need to remind ourselves daily that our singleness is not for us, but for the Lord. And not for our concerns, but for his. And I would add again for our married friends here that our marriage is not for us, but for the Lord, and not for our concerns, but for his. So singleness can give opportunities to serve Jesus in unique ways. But second, singleness can be an opportunity to demonstrate how God's family works. See, one thing people say about the Christian view of singleness and celibacy is that those people are going to miss out on intimacy. Well, it might be true, but it doesn't have to be true. And the problem here is that our culture sees sex and intimacy as the same thing. We can't separate them. We can't imagine genuine intimacy without sex. C.S. Lewis said this, and he lived 50 years ago, so it's not exactly a new thing. He said, this is a bit wordy, but hopefully you get the idea. Those who cannot conceive friendship as substantive love, but only as a disguise or elaboration of eros, which is sexual love, betray the fact that they've never had a friend. In other words, if you can't distinguish between intimacy and sex, you don't know what true friendship is. That's what he's saying. That our culture imagines that intimacy only occurs in the context of sexual attraction goes to show how little our culture actually understands and experiences true friendship. Now, King David might be a great example of someone who had this kind of true intimate friendship with his friend Jonathan. After Jonathan died, this is what David said. He said, "I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women." Now, one commentator today says on this, today it might be impossible for anyone to read this song without thinking that David and Jonathan must have enjoyed a sexual relationship. He goes on, "Didn't you find yourself quickly sniffing out something homoerotic about them?" And many scholars, I want to say, have done just that. They look at that and they said, look at this. King David had a gay relationship. But Lewis would say, well, no, they just don't understand true friendship. True friendship can be deep, it can be intimate. And yes, particularly for us blokes, that can mean we have to put aside some of those cultural stereotypes about masculinity. And the other thing I want to say about this is we don't have to be deep and intimate with everyone. Even Jesus, of course, he had the hundreds of disciples, but then he had the 12, and then he had the 3 who he was closest to, he was intimate with. And I want to say also that this is important for us married people as well. Often, married people like me, we can mistakenly expect our spouse to fulfill all our need for friendship, all our need for intimacy. But no one person can take all that burden. We need good friends outside marriage. One of the images the Bible constantly uses for church is a family. And as a family, we're called to love each other. And as a family, we're called to show hospitality to each other. Hospitality not being, where you invite someone over and you're entertaining them, you put out the best silverware, you cook your best meal, and everything's just right. Hospitality is inviting people into your regular life and your family. It's not adding something extra into your already overloaded schedule, but inviting people into what you're already doing, warts and all. Sam Albury again, he talks about how a family gave him a house key, literally, and said, "You're a member of our family, come and go as you please." Can you imagine doing that for someone? That's the kind of radical hospitality that we're called to as a church family. My friend Sam Wan, who lives in Sydney and works for a group called Living Faith, he wrote a brilliant article. It's called Interdependence in Change, if you want to look it up. I think I might have sent it out in TAP like ages ago, but I'm not sure. If not, I might send it out again this week anyway. Sam is single, and he met up in this article with a close friend who just had his first baby with his wife. The friend shared deeply of his fears and anxiety about being a new parent. And Sam came into this himself, worried about the change that this baby was going to bring to their relationship. As a single guy, he feared that this would be the end of their relationship. And quoting Sam now, he said, "In his outpouring, my friend welcomed me into his world, and I had the opportunity to enter into his anxieties and his dreams. He laid his anxieties and dreams under my feet. He seemingly had little to offer, but in presenting vulnerability, he had given me a gift. In his sharing, he loved me by letting me sit in the deep, anxious emotions of fatherhood, emotions that I may never experience. I had the opportunity to walk his insecurities with him." He said, "I don't know if it's helpful, and I'm aware that it's not the same thing, but we'd love you to be a very significant figure in this kid's life." Can you imagine that sort of invitation? Isn't that beautiful? Winding up, I'm just going to switch gears for a little bit here. One of the things I think we need wisdom for, this is in general when we're talking about Christ's sexual ethic. In other words, one thing we need to think about and think a lot before we speak is how, on one hand, we stick to this narrow biblical truth, and on the other hand, we want to say to all kinds of people that we love them. Honestly, I think it's easier to say how we don't go about that, and that's by going on publicly and loudly about what we think is right and what we think is true. Honestly, I think that's been tested and tried and has been shown to fail and not work. See, while we do believe that this is God's way and God's way is good, expecting people who don't believe in or follow Jesus to follow his ethics is really a bit silly. See, we need to show all people God's grace for them and let the Holy Spirit change them. In other words, you're not the Holy Spirit. So the short answer, how do we do that, I think is this particularly is helpful where people come in with a preconceived idea of what a Christian is. We need to show them God's grace by how we love them, by how we accept them. Going back to Paul's conclusion in 1 Corinthians 7, this is what he says. He says, whether you're single, whether you're married, make the best of the situation you're in. So if you're single, take advantage of the flexibility of that. Don't look at married people around you and only see the positives of what they're doing. If you're married, take the advantage of having a family and make the most of that. Invite others into your family. And again, don't look at the single people and, envy their free and easy life. And whether you're married or single, flee sexual immorality. That's the Bible's clear command, and love each other deeply. Now, I want to finish, of course, on a note of grace because, all of this can leave us feeling rather broken. When it comes down to it, I didn't even get into Jesus talking about, bringing this down to the thinking level, where he says you've committed as good as committed adultery if you even lust after someone. When it comes to that, we're all sexual sinners in some way, aren't we? So what does Jesus say to people like us? I'd like to finish by thinking about John 8, where a woman is brought to Jesus who has been caught red-handed in the act of adultery. And Jesus says, well, whoever's without sin casts the first stone. And they walked away, it says, from oldest to youngest. I think there's a reason from the oldest to the youngest too. The oldest had more life experience and knew what Jesus was saying and getting at, so that they came to that conclusion quicker and walked away. When they'd all walked away, Jesus said, has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Now go and leave your life of sin. That's what he says to us. Neither do I condemn you. Now go and leave your life of sin.